CN Live, Episode 9. Watch our 4-hour special on the Cold War between the United States and Russia. We look at its complexities and ask, has the worst of the crisis passed?
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to Episode 9 of CN Live. I'm Joe Loria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
On tonight's program, we devote the entire show to the ongoing crisis in U.S.-Russia relations. We will hear from a former head of the CIA Russia desk, a former retired CIA Russia analyst, an Australian diplomat who was posted to Moscow, a geopolitical analyst based in the Russian capital, a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer who served in the former Soviet Union, and a journalist who asks whether the worst of the new Cold War may be behind us. Well, we're now joined from Canberra, Australia, the capital, by Tony Kevin. Tony was the ambassador from Australia to Cambodia and to Poland, and in between 1969 and 1971, in the Brezhnev years, he was a junior diplomat in the Australian embassy in Moscow. And we're very, very happy to have him with us. He is going to talk to us about a speech that he gave on Thursday night in Canberra, which was extraordinarily interesting. Also about his recently published book, Return to Moscow, which he actually did return to Moscow after all those years and compared the Soviet days to what he saw now, and the revelations that were made to him and his understanding of Russia today. And we also want to talk to him about George Beebe's interview that we just saw. So, Tony, welcome to CN Live.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Elizabeth.
So let's start with George Beebe's speech, former CIA Russia desk chief. Did you get a lot out of it? Did you agree with him on the whole?
I got a lot out of it. I agreed with him almost totally. I think it's remarkable that an ex-CIA man can be so perceptive and to have so much empathy towards Russia, because I think one of the problems with the CIA at the moment, and particularly with its former head, who's now the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, is that they're completely lacking empathy for Russia. Pompeo went to Moscow, had talks with Lavrov, saw Putin. He came away seemingly completely unaffected by it, unlike his predecessor, Tillerson, who I think had achieved some empathy and some rapport with how Russia sees the world. And I don't know how you can be a head of a CIA, much less a Secretary of State, if you lack that quality of empathy. And George Beebe really had it in spades. So I thoroughly recommend his interview.
He seemed to point out that a lot of officials in Washington and in the intelligence agencies, in the foreign policy establishment, lack this ability to put themselves in the shoes of the other side. And I found that extraordinary because it seemed like they weren't even trying to do that, let alone being unable to do that. It could be difficult when there's a radically different culture. And you have to do that, don't you, Tony? You're a diplomat. Isn't that imperative on a diplomat? I certainly think a journalist, that is, as a foreign correspondent, you certainly must do that. Isn't that what a diplomat should be trained to do?
Coming from a small to medium-sized country, one learns that one has to do that, otherwise one's going to be laughed at. The problem is that for the United States, if I may say so, and I have a lot of American friends, there is this certain type of American, and let's say Pinkerton in Madame Butterfly, or let's say the protagonist in Graham Greene's The Quiet American, who can only see things from the point of view of America's manifest destiny and basically right to control the world. And when you've got that mindset, which unfortunately has infected even the State Department in recent years, because the military intelligence complex has really taken over Washington policy making. So when large numbers of people have that, shall I say, born to rule manifest destiny mindset, it's very hard to establish the sort of equal, mutually respectful dialogue with countries like Russia and China that George Beebe very correctly says is now necessary, given the changes in the power relationships in the world.
Well, you were able to then, when you were in Moscow in the Cold War, even then, at the height of the Cold War, one of the tense parts of the Cold War, there was you were able to try to see things from the way the Soviets saw the United States and saw the world. Is that right?
Yes, I did. And in my book, I talk about a friend in the embassy, Laurie Matheson, who became rather notorious in subsequent years. He taught me to see things the way Russia sees them. And it's essentially about geography. Russia has no natural borders to the West, and it's been open for centuries to invasion from the West. And the worst invasions of Russia have not been the Mongols, because the Mongols somehow worked through local deputies, but from the West, which actually tried to change the culture and the religion of the places they conquered. So you've got this history of centuries of armies sweeping backwards and forwards across the Great Plain between Germany and Russia with no protections. I was taken by Laurie to the Battle of Poltava, which is in Ukraine, the battleground. And this was where Russia, Peter the Great's forces, decisively defeated King Charles of Sweden's European coalition, which was invading Russia, way down in the Ukraine, about 500 kilometers south of Moscow. And that was the end of the Swedish Empire. And it was, if you like, the beginning of Russia as a great power. Russians are intensely patriotic. They will argue among themselves about faults in their government and so on. They really hate it when foreign powers basically try to control and manipulate them.
As any nation would, I think the United States, even when they aren't being controlled and manipulated, think that they are, like the last 3 years of Russiagate. So, Elizabeth, why don't you ask a few questions? Tony, please.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I was wanting to ask you about the point you make about the public being so swayed and numbed by mainstream news sources, when they're told basically narratives that are made up of disinformation over and over again, narratives that interlock. I was wondering, though, because the way that you describe that is that it is basically successful. And I was wondering what you think about at least in the United States, we have polls showing that a great quadrant of the public, a very, growing number of people amongst the public no longer trust the mainstream media sources. So do you think that's a changing situation, or do you think it is basically, maybe in Australia, really a successful propaganda narrative?
We're a little way behind you, Elizabeth. I agree with you that there is a resistance developing to the propaganda narrative. One of the things that we've learned, and I talked about this in my lecture, is that this hasn't happened accidentally. There has been a whole science of really controlling public opinion through establishing internet nodes of influence, clusters of influence, that will then provide a diverse range of sources, different sources, and massive repetition of false messages. Now, this works until you're inoculated against it by knowing what's happening. Down here in Australia, we have a terrific person called Caitlin Johnston at Kate Oz, who's probably leading the what we might call the waking up of Australia. We're not quite as far down the road as you are in America with wonderful programs like your Consortium News. We haven't got a program like this in Australia. We haven't got access to mainstream media. We haven't got access to the Australian Broadcasting Commission. But unfortunately, we're confined to social media websites like Caitlin's, and we're doing our best, and we're trying to catch up with you.
Absolutely a fan of Caitlin Johnstone, huge fan of Caitlin Johnstone's work, and I really liked that you included her work in your talk. And you mentioned the information warfare, and that ties into the Integrity Initiative. And I thought that it was really interesting the way that you discussed Orwell and his kind of prophetic vision of this information warfare, and that prophetic vision being basically fulfilled in his own country by the Integrity Initiative. So for the parts of our audience who maybe aren't familiar with that, because as you point out, it has not been covered almost at all in mainstream press. Can you describe the Integrity Initiative and the scandal surrounding that?
I'm glad to. And I'd follow that up hopefully with a quick discussion of Orwell and doublethink, because I think that's very important. But on the actual technology, a group of anonymous hackers who call themselves Anonymous late last year hacked and dumped huge quantities of original documents from the Integrity Initiative and the Institute for Statecraft, which are two rather shadowy bodies funded by the British government to the tune of about $3 million a year, and given all kinds of other help through embassy space and access to communications and so on. They are a bunch of ex-spooks, ex-army spooks, and similar types who see it as their mission to basically counter Russian disinformation. And they are obsessively wild-eyed, riveted-eyed anti-Russian people. They function out of a semi-secret premises in London, and they go around Europe and they basically recruit people in the same way in which spies are recruited, but these people are not spies, and they're not even agents of influence in traditional sense of people who influence government. They're people who are influencing the mass public through their speeches, their conferences, their symposia, their internet activity. And because there are so many of them, it provides this massive diversity of forces and basically swamping the market with anti-Russian disinformation messages. And they have been very, very effective. And even though Britain is a much smaller country than America, in a funny sort of way, they're the Greeks to America's Romans, because they are providing a lot of the intellectual impetus behind the malign, it's a word that they like to use, a malign Western disinformation campaign against Russia. And finally, there's a wonderful little 7-minute video, which a man called Colonel, what's his name? I've got a mental blank, but you know who I mean. He made a 7-minute YouTube video, and it makes wonderful watching, because you have to really watch him and see him justifying or trying to justify the work of this organisation.
Donnelly,
now, a quick word on Orwell's disinformation. Orwell's doublethink. Orwell predicted the capacity of people working in a big bureaucratic government propaganda system to doublethink, to put thoughts in and out of their mind as necessary to do their job. And it's a wonderful quote from Orwell, and I recommend people find it and read it. It's in chapter 3, because it's exactly what so many of our people in and around government and academic circles around government do. They have narratives which they can push in and out of their mind. For instance, the narrative that Russia is a declining country and the narrative that Russia threatens the world. Now you can slot these forwards and backwards as you think fit. And I can think of other examples, but I'm sure your listeners can too. It's this capacity to appear to be sincere and yet to know one is peddling a false narrative. Now, Joe asked George the question in that interview, do you think people in the system know when they're peddling lies? And George answered to the effect of, no, I think most of them are sincere. And I think most of them are sincere, but they have this capacity for doublethink, to be saying one thing while knowing it's actually not true.
That would seem to be insincere to me. If they know that it's not true, I don't care what kind of mental gymnastics they're going through. They're not saying something they know is true. And why? Because they have mortgages to pay, children to put through university, et cetera, et cetera. You have a great line in your talk in Canberra on Thursday, Tony, when you say, quote, people who work or have worked close to government in departments, politics, armed forces, top universities, mostly accept whatever they understand at the time to be the government view of truth. So that's as far as they go. To answer that question that I put to Babe, that we're discussing now accurately is almost impossible. You'd have to really question each individual person in government and in media, by the way, to see what they really think. I think there's probably a combination of true believers who who really do believe it because they're naive to some extent, or because basically it's good for their own interests. And there may be the others who have to engage in this doublethink, and then there are those who are on the verge of becoming whistleblowers all the time and mostly don't because they can't take it anymore. So I think that this is such a crucial question that one has to continue to talk about, because until people within media, within government, step outside and have the courage to do that and face consequences, possible consequences, we are never going to break through what you wrote about here in Orwell, that his 2 books, Animal Farm in 1984, you say become our manuals that can be used today by governments in the principles of information warfare. You write, or you say that their plots tell of the creation by the state of false narratives with which to control their gullible populations. And until more people step out of their official positions, if they can no longer take this contradiction that they have between what they know is true and what they're being told to be false, that false narrative will continue to work. And it's so chilling, Tony, especially when you return back to the US to see how thoroughly believed this false narrative is. I mean, people in other parts of the world, almost everywhere else in the world, even over the border in Canada, you will see people have a better idea of what the United States is really up to in the world. And once you get here, people don't have a clue. They actually believe US spreading democracy and that Russia is the threat, even though it's US 30,000 NATO troops on the Russian border. It's the US that overthrew a government on Russian borders in Ukraine. It is the US that invaded Syria. And when you, and I want to ask you this, because you go into the beginning of your talk about the lead up to the tensions that we have between Russia and the US, and you talk about Syria, but you didn't mention that Putin, when he was at the UN in September of 2015, he made an extraordinary speech. It was the last time he appeared at the UN General Assembly. He's not coming again this month. He said that he invited the United States to join in a crusade against ISIS, similar to what the US and the Soviet Union did against the Nazis, and that they had to join together to crush this group. And then, of course, the US rejected that. And the press talked about immediately that this was a Russian imperial thrust into Syria to regain their imperial glory. And I found that such an extraordinary lack of self-introspection about who has the empire these days and what exactly Putin was offering the United States. And then, as you probably know, Tony, the Obama tried later on to work with Russia against ISIS. And if you recall, Ash Carter made a mistake and they killed 65 Syrian Arab army troops, just as that deal between Kerry and Lavrov was going to be made to work together. And that destroyed that. I know I've said a lot here, but I just wanted you to give me your thoughts on some of this.
Well, a lot of thoughts on that. Number one, starting at the end, it wasn't necessarily a mistake that the 65 Russian troops were killed. That Obama basically was pursuing a two-faced policy. On the one hand, he was claiming to want to control ISIS. On the other hand, he knew very well that through Saudi Arabia and certain Gulf states, the United States weapons were flowing in massive quantities into ISIS. So basically backing both horses. Putin would not be so naive again as to appeal to the United States to join a crusade with him against terrorism. I think Putin now has pretty much given up on the United States, unfortunately. He's accepted that Russia has basically got to fight its own battles and find its own new alliances, which it's doing in Eurasia. Could the relationship with the United States ever be retrieved? I don't think so, not in a hurry, because the United States always has this hidden agenda to weaken Russia, because Russia is still the major nuclear threat to the United States, although China's coming on fairly rapidly. I don't think China's going to militarize nuclear forces to the extent that Russia has. Russia still has a much weaker force than the US, but the important thing about it is it has an invulnerable second strike deterrent force, and there is nothing the US can do about that. There's no matter how many troops they put on the Russian border, no matter how many missiles they threaten the populated regions of European Russia with, from countries like Poland and Ukraine, Poland and Romania, and possibly in the future Ukraine, although I hope not. In the end, Russia can hit back and destroy the US if its national survival is threatened. Now, the important thing to know is that the Russians understand this. They know that they have to maintain second strike deterrence. They don't need convincing of it. Americans don't understand that this is happening. Americans somehow have somehow put the nuclear second strike deterrence situation out of their minds. They're pretending that because they have much larger defense forces than Russia, bases all around the world and so forth, that they are the stronger power, and that Russia is somehow a weak country that happens to have a lot of natural resources. Well, it may be true in one sense, but it's certainly not true in the sense of nuclear deterrence.
Sorry, a lot of resources that the United States would like to get their hands on. And I think that's what we saw in the Yeltsin years when Wall Street swooped in, made alliances with local oligarchs and asset stripped the country and carted out untold numbers of rubles and dollars out of the country and impoverished the Russian population. I first visited Moscow in 1995 in November, and I saw a devastating scene of camps of homeless people outside the train stations building fires. People, I twice almost was robbed, and cops were stopping my cab drivers for bribes. It was chaos. And I went back exactly 20 years later in November of 2015. I saw a totally different place. I had just left Berlin, and it didn't seem much different from Berlin. It was a modern contemporary European city, well lit, clean, safe, functioning above all. And Americans wonder why Putin is popular in Russia. But my experience was nothing like yours. You went back after a much longer period. Give us what the contrast that you saw from 69, 71 to this decade when you returned.
Well, there's great pride now in Russia. People feel proud of their achievements. They're proud that they've done it by themselves. There is, I think, a rejection of the Western imperialist project, which those years that you remember, and George Beeber's very good on this too in his interview, like all great empires, they have their light side and their dark side. Yes, as George says, there are a lot of well-meaning, idealistic Americans who were setting up think tanks and institutes in Moscow and trying to help bring the Russians towards prosperity under the American aegis. But there were others, as you say, who were ripping off the country mercilessly, and there were Russian oligarchs who were prepared to work with them. Now, what Putin has done since 2002, he's cleaned all that out. What you might call the disloyal oligarchs have been removed. People like Berezovsky and Khovardovsky have left the country. The new oligarchs are more like American industrial barons, more like the Rockefellers. They are, yes, they're very greedy, they like to live well, but they are patriotic and they work with the government, close to the government. Now, there's a tradition going right back to the Tsarist days of industrial development through massive state-favoured enterprises. So the Tsars used to dole out the railway franchise, the water franchise, electricity franchise to different favoured top families like the Rockefellers. And these great families developed Russia at a very rapid rate in the 19th century. Putin, in a way, is going back to that, but he is very conscious of the need for social balance and the need for safety valves. And he knows how to listen. So there's this old tradition in Russia of the Tsar listening to the people when the robber barons under the Tsar get out of control. It's a theme running right through Russian history. And Putin is very alert to that. I do not think that Putin is sitting there sending out murder squads around the world. I do not think that Putin is exercising a detailed malign control over the lives of 150 million Russians. I think he's a decent man, an honourable man, and he is doing his best to protect his country against the very considerable enemies that surround it. So whenever I go back to Russia, I feel a great sense of comfort and peace. I feel it's the civil society that works well. I could talk about Navalny's demonstrations if I wanted to, but they are very minor and they are very well behaved. They have a message. Yes, they want democracy to be improved. They don't want voting slates to be manipulated. But goodness me, look at the Democratic National Congress. Look at the way people like Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders are struggling to get a voice in that party at the moment. Every country has its shameful aspects of democracy. The important thing about Russia, I think, is that it's moving forward steadily. And every time I go back, it feels more normal, it feels more comfortable, it feels more civilized.
Shameful to hear in light of the way that the West is treating its dissidents and its dissenting voices. But that brings me to a question I wanted to ask about your talk, and that was that you mentioned Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning as victims to some extent of this increased tension between Russia and the West. And I wanted to ask you what you meant exactly by that, because I know that the Russiagate narrative has definitely tried to smear Assange as somehow a tool of Russia in publishing the Podesta and DNC emails. But, Chelsea Manning's leaks and the publications of WikiLeaks around, 2010, 2011, really didn't have much to do with Russia and weren't really part of this Russiagate scenario. So I wanted to get to understand and have you expand a little bit on that point.
I'm glad to, and it's important to do so. You're quite correct that Assange and Chelsea Manning are not, in my opinion, and not in the opinion of many reasonable observers, connected to Russia. Assange has always been specific on that point. But of course, the people whose minds have been taken over by the malign Russophobia narrative try desperately to link Assange and Chelsea Manning to Russia. I mean, they even tried to link me to Russia. Just to be personal for a moment, I've been called a Putin puppet and a Kremlin stooge. I've been called naive, and I've been called open to exploitation by Russia. I reject all those accusations, and Assange and Chelsea Manning quite properly reject similar allegations against them. They have campaigned for freedom and the right of the public to know when their own government commits atrocities. And I'm very glad we know about what happened in Iraq under the US occupation. I'm very glad we know about what happens in Afghanistan and the continuing war there. And I think that the attempt to silence Assange and Manning is shameful. And it is done for two reasons. One, vindictiveness, it's simply a desire to punish someone who slapped the imperium in the face. But more importantly, to deter others. They really want to send these two people to the lines in order to make it less likely that others will follow. But others are following. I mean, down here in Australia now, we've got a few very high-profile cases of people who have defied the secrecy of the state, where they felt that there were human rights and governance issues involved in basically making things public that needed to be made public. So, you're not going to stop freedom. You're not going to stop dissidents. Even in Australia, it's working.
Do you think that the Integrity Initiative and efforts like it have become more successful thanks to the silencing of people like Assange when he was removed from Twitter and ultimately, arrested and thrown into Belmarsh? Do you think that that's had a positive effect on those propaganda narratives, or do you think that they have been exposed to such an extent that it doesn't really affect them?
I feel great grief at what's happening to Julian, great grief. And I wish we could help save him. I don't know whether we can help save him. I think he continues to be a beacon and an example to people. So I don't think that the forces of truth and virtue have been set back by this.
Good. Do you think overall, because your discussion covers basically a broad bird's eye view of the entire tension and history of that tension between Russia and the West, specifically the US and the UK especially. Can you give a sense of where you think this is going? I doubt, just because the Integrity Initiative and other efforts like that have been exposed to the public, or albeit not covered much in mainstream media, obviously that isn't going to stop those efforts from continuing. Where do you see this going in the future, short term and long term?
It's a brave man who predicts the future. But let me say that I see some hope in the interest on the continent of Europe in achieving some sort of normalization of relations with Russia. The Baltic Gas Pipeline, despite huge American efforts to stop it, does seem to be approaching completion. And once that cheap Russian energy is flowing into Germany, there will then be a very massive economic link between Russia and Europe, which is very important. I think Macron understands this. There is, of course, the tendency to say, let's make friends with Russia and then use them against China. So there's always an ulterior motive. But the Russians are smart enough now not to fall for it. They will go into it with their eyes wide open. I think that the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries, America, Britain, Canada, Australia, to a lesser extent New Zealand, but those four certainly will be the last to smell the coffee, because we are so under the thumb now of the Russophobic narrative that I think it's going to be a long time. I think that we haven't talked much about US internal politics, but I think that Trump has now come totally under the thumb of Mike Pompeo, representing the American deep state. Trump was really terrified when he saw what happened to him in the Helsinki summit, when he was basically the whole American media and power, they basically turned their back on him after he had that meeting with Putin, and he was isolated, friendless, terrified. He's now basically Pompeo's patsy. I'm sorry to say that, but there's not much he's going to be allowed to do without the deep state through Pompeo controlling it. James Mattis is gone. So many people are gone, people who were quite sensible. And I have a little bit in my talk where I run through the huge list of what I call casualties of Russophobia. Some of them might be bad guys. I don't think very highly of Paul Manafort, but a lot of them are not bad guys. I don't think Flynn was necessarily such a bad guy. He was a highly decorated general. He made a bureaucratic sort of mistake early in his tenure. He was mercilessly cut down and went to jail. And of course, Tillerson was treated badly. It's going to be quite hard for the forces of integrity and governance to regroup in Washington and London, because there are some very bad guys there. Now, it would be wonderful, for example, if against all the odds, Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister. I think that would be a huge plus. But we'll have to wait and see.
So you believe Trump is a Pompeo puppet, not a Putin puppet?
I do.
But
I think Pompeo is smart enough to cut him a bit of slack. I mean, Pompeo lets him have his frolics here and there. But, when the chips are down, the key decision points, the system takes control.
Well, you said there's a lot of bad reasonable people left, but a very unreasonable one just left, John Bolton. And I think that speaks well for taking some of the pressure off Trump, certainly with Iran, where, by the way, Flynn was a big Islamophobe. He was perhaps reasonable on Russia and other issues, but certainly, and in the Middle East, on Syria, he was the one who revealed this Defense Intelligence Agency document that showed that as way back as August 2012, an analyst had predicted that there would be the rise of the Islamic State, and that the U.S. and their allies in Turkey and the Gulf were supporting this effort to create a principality or principate in eastern Syria, which would later turn into the Islamic State. And Flynn confirmed that was correct, and it was leaked, of course. It was actually released by a judge in a court case, that classified document. But when it comes to Bolton being gone, you think that is helpful in any way towards relations with Russia? I mean, his main thing was North Korea and Iran, but he was no friend of Russia either.
Look, I'm delighted to see Bolton gone. As most people of goodwill are. He was a loathsome and dangerous man in that job. However, there's a Russian proverb or a Russian old folk tale that, when you're in a sleigh and you're being pursued by a mob of hungry wolves, if you've got someone you're prepared to throw out, like a serf, that will decoy the wolves and hopefully you'll get away. I think that certain people thought that at this point Bolton might be expendable so that the wolves get distracted.
But the reins are still in Pompeo's hands, in your opinion?
I believe so, yes.
So was Trump sincere, in your opinion, looking back now over these years, in wanting better relations with Russia? And can he still win? He has not started a major war with anyone, by the way. It's the best thing to probably say about Trump. And he's still pressing for better, really wants Russia back in the G7. And Macron did make that speech where he was saying that we better, whether that is to try to divide Russia and China, which is probably too late. I think they've been brought together too much by the U.S. since Ukraine and other instances of this anti-Russian fervor on the West. I don't think you can pry the two to get apart. But was Trump sincere about this, and can he follow through in the end in getting better relations? with Russia, even with Pompeo on his back?
The answer to that is a very important question, and I think that it depends on whether Trump grows a pair, to be frank. He certainly has the presidential authority, but a president exercises power through his lieutenants. He says it shall be done, and it will be done, he hopes. He could still make a difference, but it will require a character and moral fibre on his part, which I haven't seen a great deal of it yet, but we remain hopeful. Certainly Russia, if it gets the chance to rejoin the B7 and make a G8, will take that chance because they're professionals. They know that any tool in diplomacy is worth using if it has prospect of success. Russia will never again fall for the Western trick of saying, be part of our club and we will hold the rest of the world at bay. Russia will never fall for that again. And Russia, of course, has got its own experience of dealing with Islamic terrorism, its own experience of dealing with Central Asia, its former constituent Soviet republics. It's got massive expertise to draw on in dealing with China and Asia. And the prospects of a strong Eurasian economic community forming are very good. And it's happening very rapidly. We in the Anglosphere, we don't see how rapidly it's happening because our media don't bother reporting on it. Because our media really only report on Russia and increasingly China when there's a sting in the tail that they can put in the tail. That they are only interested in bad news. When there's good news, they simply spike it and it doesn't get beyond the wire services. A good example of that was the meeting just held in Vladivostok.
Right.
65 countries, about 3,000 participants, several prime ministers, the Prime Minister of India, of Malaysia, of Japan, and a great many representatives of all the other Asian countries were there with Putin to talk about Eurasian economic cooperation. It's happening very rapidly. And it's very important. One of my messages is it's very important for not just my country, Australia, but for the United States itself to get on board these initiatives. If the world divides into two opposing economic blocs, one based on the dollar and another one based on the Chinese and Russian currencies, it's not going to be good for the world economy, obviously, and it's not going to be good for world peace.
What did you see of that major conference in a Western newspaper, Tony?
Well, if you look it up in Google, you see it gets quite well reported in all the newspapers of India, Malaysia, Japan, and so on, workmanlike professional reporting. I couldn't see any Western reporting on it, Joe.
Isn't that
I certainly couldn't see any Australian reporting, but I couldn't see even in Bloomberg there wasn't much on it.
Isn't that something? When Putin makes a major speech, it's never reported. Because if they did report that, they wouldn't be able to get away with telling the American people and the European people what they think Russia's all about, rather than doing their jobs as reporters, reporting a speech objectively and just laying it out there. We need to know what Putin is saying. They don't want the American people to know what Putin is saying. And why? Because that narrative, that false narrative, going back to Orwell, that is created to control the population, would start to chip away and fray and be undermined. And they can't have that. They can't have an honest intellectual inquiry in our societies. They need us to believe a certain narrative of how the world works, and it is completely false in the end of the day. It is delusional to the point where it's difficult to interact with American people here in the U.S. On these issues. Can't talk to a handful of people that I know that I could speak with about these in rational terms. Otherwise, everyone else, it's impossible. You have to be dismissed.
Let me give you an anecdote here. When I started reading in what I hoped was a balanced, even-handed way a few years ago on these questions of major world politics, I initially had a sort of a frisson of fear every time I punched in the URL for stations like Sputnik or Russia Today or the Russian Foreign Ministry or TASS. I felt fear. I thought, gosh, I shouldn't really be doing this. In fact, I was just like Winston Smith feeling guilty when he's in his flat. Gosh, I shouldn't be reading this forbidden book, and having to hide it under the desk so the TV monitor couldn't see it. I mean, I know that everything I do on internet can be recorded by somebody. I know there are no secrets on internet. It took me quite a few weeks to get over my initial sense of fear at accessing the other side's websites. And all of those countries, not just Russia, but Germany, France, and so on, China, they all publish English language versions of their major news agency sites. So I can read TASS, Russia Today, Sputnik, Deutsche Welle, Xinhua. I can read them all in English. So there's no technical excuse not to access this sort of information. You just have to get over the initial fear of doing so.
And leading on from that, I'd like to ask you or invite you to kind of describe the censorship you've experienced, because you described it in your talk, but I'd like to have our audience understand what you've kind of been through since you've developed this view of Russia, especially since the publication of your book.
Well, I certainly haven't been sent to a gulag or to Guantanamo. I'm prosperous. I'm living comfortably as a retired man on a retired government pension. Having said that, about 3 months after my book was published, some very strange things started to happen. I was invited to speak at the Melbourne Writers' Festival, which is our largest writers' festival in Australia. I had a capacity ticketed audience of people interested to hear what I had to say, about 200 or 300 people. I was hoping to sell about 200 books in the usual sign and sell arrangement that they have at writers' festivals. Goodness me, every box of my books disappeared. They didn't turn up at the Writers' Festival. We never established why or how, but I suspect there were people in the distribution chain, and publishing and book promotion is heavily infected with people who sympathise with Integrity Initiative type viewpoints on Russia. I think the word went out, let's create a little bit of upstream interference for Tony Kevin, let's lose his books, and they got lost. This kind of stuff went on happening. I was scheduled to appear in a debate with a British academic on Russia-China relations, major debating forum. 2 weeks before it, long after the advertising had gone out, his organising company pulled him. They said, sorry, he's got another commitment. Debate fell down, didn't happen. The Australian Broadcasting Commission has pretty much stopped inviting me on screen to talk about foreign policy. I've stopped being invited to writers' festivals. I've received no book prizes for this book, no shortlisting, no longlisting, even though I'd won 3 book prizes for my previous books. So it sort of goes on. And I have this feeling that I've been, in a civilized but very effective way, pushed out of taking part in the national debate on foreign policy.
And while you may not be in a gulag and maybe your personal situation is not endangered, that's still an absence in the social discourse that is felt, that is real. I mean, the outlets that are American, Australian, writers like Caitlin Johnstone, all of them virtually experience some type of censorship or attack or smears. As an independent journalist myself, I've been smeared by Integrity Initiative tied individuals. Like, it is pervasive. Do you think that there's any chance that this will be fought back by people like Caitlin Johnstone becoming so popular? Do you think that's a successful fight that we're having at the moment?
Well, I have to believe that, and the fact that you've invited me onto your international program is proof that we are making headway. And what Caitlin does every week, she puts out an incredible essay or several essays that are pertinent and to the point and have an increasingly wide circulation, not only in Australia but around the world. Australians, of course, have a record of dissidents. I mean, not only Caitlin and Julian Assange, but going back to John Pilger and going back before him to Rupert Lockwood, all sorts of people. Australian journalists have been crusaders for truth, and I feel I'm in that tradition in a modest sort of way, and we will go on doing that.
Tony, I want to thank you for joining us on CN Live. We can go on for much longer talking about so many things. We didn't get onto the Skripals incident, which you mentioned last night, which was another part of what seems like to be this pretty much British-run campaign, but America's falling in some ways, that has undermined the most important relationship in the world, probably the two most powerful nuclear weapon states that need to get along, cannot afford tensions, because that is the real basis of George Beebe's book, by the way, was the possibility of an accidental war between both countries. And I hope that the worst of the tension between Russia and the U.S. has passed us. So let's finish with a final question for you. Tony, is the worst behind us between Russia and the U.S.? And we came maybe close in Syria to some conflict. Are we those days behind us, the possible accidental war?
I don't think the worst is behind us. No, I don't. I think, the war that could have happened in Syria after the Duma fake attack staged by the White Helmets could happen again after a fake attack that gets out of control in the Straits of Hormuz off the coast of Iran. I think that George Beebe said a very important thing, and I'm sure it's a major theme of his book, that the West is captive to this Munich appeasement meme in its thinking about Russia, that it somehow put Putin's Russia in the position of Hitler's Germany, and you can't appease, you have to fight back all the time. Whereas, as George said, the better analogy is pre-1914 Europe. The risk of war breaking out by accident or misjudgment or miscalculation has pretty much happened the way World War I broke out. So I think that's a really important thought to leave your readers with, listeners with. I would say the Skripals case is terribly important to read about because it is so obviously, transparently fake. And yet, double think again, people have been induced to believe it because, hello, the British bureaucracy cannot lie. Allegedly, but of course it can lie, and it does with great alacrity. And I finally would like to suggest that I think you're putting my whole talk up on your consortium website. And
already up on the site, that's right.
I'd urge people to read it. I think, as you say, it's a bit of a bird's eye view over the whole terrain of East-West relations, and it's quite a good introduction to a lot of more specific, closer focus reading. I am worried, and I hope that going on this program helps a little bit to strengthen the forces of good sense and moderation.
Well, we're really happy to have had you, as you're one of the minority, as we are, who do not buy the narrative that's being sold to us, and that makes it really hard to keep our wits about us sometimes, because we are in the minority, and they act by being the majority. They must be right because they sell more newspapers, they have a larger audience, they make more money, they control more, so they must be right. Well, of course, we know that that's not true at all. So we're going to continue going forward, if we can, with analyzing what that narrative is, how it's wrong, and what other facts they are omitting to create the false narrative that they have. And I really happy to have Tony on today from Canberra to give us his incredible insights into U.S.-Russian relations, Western-Russian relations, and his own personal experiences there. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Joe.